The first thing you notice is the smell. Not smoke. Not ash. Something thicker. A sweetness that turns rancid the moment it hits your tongue. A century has passed, but the record still describes it, a scent that did not belong to firewood, nor coal, nor flesh alone, but something else, something that clung to the walls for decades, as though the house itself would never be clean again. This was written in a field report from 1892, long after the event had supposedly been erased. The investigator had stumbled upon a crumbling estate outside Havana. And in the center of its blackened ruins, half swallowed by vines, stood the mouth of an old industrial furnace, sealed, cracked, but unmistakable. He recorded only one phrase inside the file before the rest was redacted: 17 names. One woman. A furnace that ate more than coal. Her name was Esperanza de Lima. And if you have never heard it before, that is by design. Because the story you are about to hear is one that colonial authorities buried, missionaries refused to acknowledge, and archivists marked for destruction. But like all forbidden truths, pieces remain, scattered in diaries, trial notes smuggled from court, and the half-burned letters of men who never returned from the plantations they thought they owned. 17 men. Burned alive in 1724. And a woman whose silence has echoed for 3 centuries. Esperanza was born in 1698, somewhere between Portugal and Brazil. That phrase, somewhere between, repeats often in her records. No baptismal certificate has survived, and the church registers list her parents only as mixed. In colonial language, this was less a description than an accusation, proof she did not belong anywhere cleanly. Her earliest memory, preserved in a later deposition, was of being taken across the ocean as a child. She remembered the rocking of the ship, the iron chains she could hear but not see, and the priest who pressed a silver crucifix into her hand and told her to forget. By the time she reappears in traceable history, Esperanza was living as a servant girl in Havana, working in the kitchens of a plantation family whose wealth came from sugar, tobacco, and coal. Observers wrote she had eyes like burned glass, not a poetic flourish, but an unnerving detail that surfaces in multiple descriptions from the time. She was neither a slave nor free, a condition that colonial society loved to enforce. Legally tethered to the household, given tasks that blurred between obedience and servitude, and always under suspicion. But what drew whispers around Esperanza was not her place, but her silence. House records say she sometimes went days without speaking. Not refusal, just absence. When pressed, she would answer in perfect, measured Portuguese, her voice so soft that overseers accused her of mocking them. Yet she had an uncanny memory. She would listen once to a recipe, a hymn, or a set of instructions, and repeat them years later without error. Her silence, one overseer wrote, felt like it was listening back. No one then could imagine how carefully she was watching, recording, and waiting. The first death came quietly. In 1717, the plantation master's youngest son was found dead in the coal yard, his lungs black with soot. At the time, it was ruled an accident. The boy had wandered too close to the furnace, inhaled too much ash, and collapsed. But the records note something strange. His shoes had been removed. His body lay carefully arranged beside the coal bin, palms open as if in prayer. And next to him, scorched into the wood, was a single symbol, a circle cut through by 2 lines. When questioned, Esperanza denied knowing anything. Yet one servant remembered seeing her the night before, standing barefoot near the furnace, tracing shapes into the soot with her finger. The overseer struck her, demanding an explanation. She simply looked at him and said, "Some doors only open from inside." For years after, nothing more happened. The plantation continued its brutal rhythm. Harvests, shipments, debts, punishments. Men drank, women obeyed, coal burned. Esperanza remained a shadow in the kitchen, stirring pots, cleaning embers, humming songs no one recognized. But something was building, slow and imperceptible like pressure in a sealed chamber. And when it finally broke, it would consume not just one man, but 17. The year Havana recorded its hottest summer. The year ships carrying enslaved men and women arrived in endless waves, bodies crammed so tightly the decks rotted from the salt of their sweat. It was also the year that a coalition of plantation owners gathered to expand their coal operations. 17 men, each with holdings in land, labor, or sugar. They met often in the de Lima estate, partly because its furnace was the largest in the province. It began as a dinner. Servants carried trays of roasted pork, cassava, and rum. The men toasted their profits, boasting of shipments and contracts. Outside, the furnace roared, fed with coal brought by men whose names were never written. Witnesses later claimed that Esperanza moved among the tables with an unnatural calm. She poured the drinks, refilled the platters, and then disappeared into the furnace yard. What happened next was reconstructed only from fragments. The only surviving report, now brittle and water-stained, was written by a Jesuit priest sent to bless the estate the following morning. He wrote, "The furnace burned past dawn, though no coal remained. The air was thick with cries that did not sound like voices but like the tearing of cloth. When at last the fire was doused, nothing was left of the men save fragments too fused to identify. Their rings melted together. Their bones charred as if pressed into the coal itself. And upon the ash floor one set of footprints, bare, leading away from the blaze. 17 plantation owners, vanished in a single night. Esperanza was never found at the estate again. Whispers spread faster than officials could contain them. Some said she had locked the men inside, lured them with promises of fortune, then sealed the furnace doors with iron pins only she could move. Others swore she had not killed them at all, that the furnace had simply opened like a mouth and swallowed them alive. A letter from one overseer, intercepted before it was destroyed, wrote, "She was not servant nor witch. She was memory itself. And memory is fire." The Spanish crown tried desperately to bury the event. Official decrees claimed the men had perished in an accidental explosion of coal dust. Compensation was quietly arranged for their widows. New owners were installed who swore loyalty to the empire. As for Esperanza, her name was erased. But erasure leaves shadows. In some regions, Esperanza became a whispered curse, muttered when furnaces cracked or when overseers disappeared. Her legend did not end in Havana. Reports of her presence ripple outward, like smoke carried by wind. In Jamaica, rumors told of a barefoot woman seen walking near coal pits, her face obscured by soot. In Veracruz, miners claimed a stranger visited their camp, asking only for a single ember. And in Louisiana, nearly a century later, slave narratives mention a woman of the furnace, who promised that the fire would one day devour their masters. The crown wanted silence. But silence, like Esperanza herself, listens. Even now, scholars who dig into her story find themselves unnerved. I have seen the files myself. Brown folders with missing pages, margins slashed with red ink, and names scratched out until only ghosts remain. In one archive, a diary belonging to Father Rodrigo de Aviles, who investigated the furnace in 1725, survives with entire passages blackened. But in the right light you can still trace the words beneath. One entry reads, "She did not burn them. They burned themselves. She only gave them the silence to hear it." What did he mean? Was Esperanza a conspirator, an avenger, or something far stranger? A vessel through which the plantation's own violence consumed itself? The psychological weight of her presence unsettled everyone she encountered. Witnesses described not fear but exposure, like she had peeled away the masks of power, forcing men to see themselves as the monsters they had made. And perhaps that is why they feared her so deeply. Because in her silence they heard the truth. If you're watching this now, I want you to feel the weight of that silence. Imagine sitting in that plantation hall, laughter still ringing in the air, when you notice the furnace outside burning hotter than it should. Imagine realizing that the woman who served you your drink is gone, and that the walls themselves seem to lean closer. That's not horror in the theatrical sense, it's horror in the psychological sense. The awareness that your power means nothing when the ground you stand on rejects you. This is why the story of Esperanza de Lima remains dangerous. It is not just about murder. It is about the inversion of control, the moment when those who built empires of suffering became trapped in the very machine they commanded. And it leaves us with a question that no official report dared to write. Did Esperanza plan this, or was she simply the final spark that lit an inevitable fire? The furnace still stands in Havana, though most tourists will never know where. Locals avoid it. Children dare each other to touch the rusted door. And some nights the old smell returns, not ash, not coal, not flesh, but something that makes your stomach tighten before you even breathe it in. If you've followed me this far, pause for a moment. Leave a comment with the words, "The furnace remembers." Let it mark you as someone who has stepped inside this archive, someone who knows a truth others were never meant to hear. And if you want to walk further into these shadows, join our Society of Truth Seekers by subscribing. Not to a channel, but to a way of seeing, one where history does not lie dormant but waits like coals under ash, ready to breathe again. Because we are only halfway down this path. Esperanza's story did not end in Havana. What followed were trials, purges, disappearances, and something darker. An experiment in psychological erasure so thorough that even memory itself began to warp. And in the next part, I'll show you the letters smuggled out of her supposed imprisonment, letters that may not have been written by her at all. The letters appear suddenly, almost suspiciously, in 1731. 7 years after the furnace, 7 years after Esperanza had supposedly vanished into smoke. They are catalogued in a private archive in Madrid, marked with the word anonymous, but each bears the same distinctive hand, slanted, deliberate, with long descending tails on every Y and G. Scholars argue endlessly over their authenticity. Some claim they were forgeries by abolitionist priests. Others believe they were confessions written under duress. But the strangest thing is not what the letters say but what they refuse to say. The first letter opens simply, "I am not buried where they think. I am held where stone breathes. The air here is not air but memory. I write to you not with ink but with what remains." No signature. No date. Only a smear of black at the bottom of the page, as though the writer had dipped her fingers in soot instead of ink. The authorities who handled these letters labeled them delusional and incoherent. But if you read closely, a different pattern emerges, one of deliberate encryption. For instance, every seventh line contains a word that seems out of place. Amber, circle, silence, coal. When strung together they read, "The circle of silence remembers." Why would someone risk writing in code unless they knew their letters would be censored? The second letter is harder to dismiss. "They believe they locked me beneath the monastery. They do not understand. The walls breathe. At night I hear the stones move. Sometimes I wake and the cell is not the same. The door remains but the room has turned." There is a detail here that is chilling in its specificity. Records confirm that, during the 1720s, the Crown frequently used monastery basements as holding cells for heretical women. The Dominican convent in Havana, in particular, had a subterranean complex with shifting partitions, designed not for efficiency but disorientation. Guards could rotate walls, alter hallways, and even seal entire corridors, creating a labyrinth meant to break the prisoner's mind. Esperanza, or whoever wrote these letters, was describing a very real place. A place engineered for psychological dissolution. One guard's diary, discovered in fragments, corroborates this. He wrote, "The woman does not cry. She does not beg. When we change the walls, she only sits and listens. One night I heard her humming. The sound seemed to come from all around, as if the stone itself carried it." Imagine being in that cell. The floor damp, the air stale with mold, and every morning you wake to find the door in a different place. How long before you begin to question not just your surroundings but yourself? The third letter contains a passage that is almost unbearable to read aloud. They put me in darkness, but the dark does not frighten me. It is their light that wounds. Their torches scream. Their prayers scratch. The fire here is not fire. It is hunger. They do not know it feeds on them. Notice again the inversion. For most prisoners, fire would represent danger. But for Esperanza, it was the torchlight of the priest that felt violent, not the darkness. As though she had come to see silence, shadow, and coal not as absence, but as her element. Psychologists who later studied the letters speculated that Esperanza had developed a dissociative relationship with fire, not fearing it but embodying it. In modern terms, we might call it radical internalization. She had absorbed the violence done to her people and transformed it into a consuming force. The fire was no longer outside, it was her. And if that is true, then the furnace of 1724 was not an anomaly, it was a beginning. By the time the seventh letter appears, the writing has grown sharper, almost triumphant. They cannot erase me. They cannot bind silence. The walls they build are the walls they burn. Tell them the furnace is never closed. Tell them 17 was only the start. 17 was only the start. We must pause here because this line is the pivot of the entire case. For decades, scholars assumed this 17 referred strictly to the plantation owners. But in 1756, 32 years later, another unexplained fire consumed a sugar refinery outside Veracruz. No survivors. And among the rubble, a charred beam was discovered with the same symbol scorched into it, the circle cut by two lines. Coincidence? Or continuation? The Spanish crown dismissed the connection, of course. They could not afford to admit that an executed or vanished woman was haunting their colonies across decades. But oral traditions in the Caribbean tell a different story. In whispered songs, Esperanza did not die. She traveled. She appeared wherever there was coal, wherever there was fire, wherever silence needed to speak. At this point in the archive, the trail begins to splinter. Official reports fragment into contradictions. Some claim Esperanza was executed in 1726, her body burned to prevent veneration. Others insist she died in prison, buried beneath the convent floor. Yet none of these claims include physical proof. No grave. No remains. Only silence. And silence, as we have seen, was always her weapon. One particularly unsettling record comes from 1763, nearly 40 years later. It is a ship's log from a British vessel stationed near Jamaica. The captain records seeing a lone woman standing at the mouth of an abandoned furnace at night. He describes her as barefoot, her dress torn but intact, her hair streaked with ash. When they approached, she turned, looked directly at them, and walked into the furnace mouth. The captain insists he saw her body dissolve, not consumed by flames but by shadow. The men fled. The Crown dismissed the account as hallucination. Yet the log was preserved and it bears his signature. So what do we make of this? Here is one interpretation. Esperanza de Lima was a woman brutalized by empire, silenced by hierarchy, but whose silence became so complete, so absolute, that it inverted. Silence turned to presence. Absence became force. And through this she became less a person than a phenomenon. A fire that did not burn wood or flesh alone, but memory. Here is another interpretation. Esperanza never survived the convent. She died in those cells, alone, and the letters are fabrications. But the story of her furnace became so powerful that it outlived her, spreading like wildfire across colonies hungry for vengeance. In this reading, Esperanza was transformed into myth by the very people who suffered under the men she killed. A myth that could not be executed because it lived in every whisper of revolt. And perhaps both are true. Perhaps Esperanza was both woman and myth, both silence and fire. Before we move further, I want to ask you something. If you are still watching, leave a comment with the phrase, "The walls breathe." It will mark you as one of the few who has followed Esperanza into her labyrinth, someone who understands that history is not just a list of facts, but a furnace, burning, consuming, reshaping. because what comes next is darker still. The story of what the Crown did to erase Esperanza was not just censorship. It was an early form of psychological warfare. They did not merely destroy her records. They engineered absence itself. They began to experiment with memory. And in the next fragments of this archive, we find proof of something chilling. Entire villages where the inhabitants claimed to remember nothing. No names, no dates, no events, just silence stretching back for years. And every time it began near a furnace. The first of these silent villages appears in records from 1742. The town of San Aurelio, a small settlement inland from Havana, was discovered abandoned, not empty but hollow. When inspectors arrived, they found the inhabitants alive, sitting in doorways, walking the streets, tending to fields. Yet when questioned, not one could state their name, their family, or even the year. Entire lifetimes had been erased. The inspectors described it in cold language, a paralysis of memory, as if the mind had been swept clean. Their eyes remained bright, but vacant, like windows without houses. The church moved quickly to cover it up. Priests declared the village cursed, attributing it to pagan enchantments. Survivors were relocated, dispersed into other towns, and San Aurelio was left to decay. Today, its ruins lie buried under cane fields. But in one forgotten report, a final line chills the page. At the edge of the town stood an old coal furnace. Still warm, though no fire had been lit. Cases like this recur, scattered across the Caribbean. Veracruz, 1751. A sugar mill where workers suddenly refused to speak. They moved their lips, gestured, even tried to write, but no sound emerged. The overseer, furious, whipped them. They made no cry. Days later, he was found dead beside the furnace, his mouth filled with ash. Trinidad, 1767. A plantation chapel where Sunday Mass was interrupted when the entire congregation forgot the Lord's Prayer midway through. The priest recorded that their mouths moved but no words came, as if language itself had abandoned them. That same night, the chapel burned, though no lightning struck and no torch was near. Witnesses swore they saw a barefoot woman standing in the flames. The Crown began to panic. These were not isolated tragedies. They were fractures in memory, eruptions of silence. And always, somewhere nearby, the trace of Esperanza's presence, whether symbol, furnace, or whisper. By 1770, colonial authorities launched what they called the Erasure Program. It was never admitted publicly, but its blueprints survive in fragments. The idea was not to capture Esperanza, but to erase her entirely, not just from records but from thought itself. To control memory at its root. One directive reads, erase not only her name but all reference to fire outside permitted context. Coal shall be industrial, never spiritual. Silence shall be obedience, never resistance. The woman must be unthinkable. This is where the story becomes less about Esperanza herself and more about the machine built to contain her. The Crown feared her, yes, but more than that, they feared the possibility she represented. That silence could become weapon, that memory could rebel. And so they weaponized forgetting. In practice, this meant whole villages ordered to destroy their oral traditions. Children forbidden to sing certain songs. Books burned not because of her name, but because they contained words like furnace or ember in unusual combinations. What they created was an empire of controlled absence. And yet, the more they tried to erase, the more Esperanza seemed to persist. In fact, erasure may have fed her legend. A Jesuit scholar, writing in 1783, observed, "The more they strike her from the page, the more she dwells in the margins. Absence is her body." This line resonates even now because it points to something larger, the psychology of suppression. When you tell people not to think of a woman who burned 17 masters alive, you plant her more firmly in their minds. You make her a forbidden figure, a ghost they can never speak but always feel. Esperanza became not just history but contagion, a silence that spread. Consider the case of Santo Domingo, 1791, during the early sparks of the Haitian Revolution. Revolutionaries reported seeing a woman at their gatherings, silent, listening. They called her La Hoguera, the bonfire. She never spoke, never ate, never aged. But when she stood near, their plans sharpened, their rage intensified. Was she real? A hallucination? Or Esperanza herself, stepping once again out of the furnace of history? When French forces tried to dismiss these accounts, they destroyed every mention of her. But one letter survived, written by a terrified officer. It is not their guns I fear. It is their silence. It is as if the silence has a face. Even into the 19th century, long after the crown had waned, Esperanza's shadow lingered. Slave narratives collected in Louisiana tell of a woman who appeared in dreams, standing at the mouth of a furnace, promising liberation. One former slave recalled, "She did not speak. But when I woke, I remembered her eyes and I knew I could not stay." The pattern is unmistakable. She is always silent, always barefoot, always near fire. And she always appears when memory itself is at stake, when people are being told to forget who they are, what they have suffered, or what they might yet become. Was Esperanza flesh, myth, or something in between? The answer may not matter. Because by this point she had become archetype, a force of psychological resistance, born from the empire's attempt to crush her. And now, 3 centuries later, we are still uncovering her trail. I have sat in archives where her name is scratched out, where the ink still smells faintly of smoke. I have seen the symbols etched faintly into stone, circled 2 lines, like a scar the empire could never fully erase. And I have read testimonies from villagers who, even in the 20th century, whispered about the woman who listens. Sometimes when historians speak of her, the air in the room changes. A hush settles, not of reverence but of unease. Because Esperanza de Lima is not just history. She is a mirror held up to every act of violence we would rather forget. If you've stayed with me this far, you are now among the few who carry her story. Mark yourself in the comments with the phrase, "Silence is fire." Let it be a signal, to me, to others, and perhaps even to Esperanza herself, that you are listening. And if you wish to keep descending with us, subscribe, not as a follower but as part of our society of truth seekers, those willing to step into archives the world wanted sealed. Because the final fragments are the most disturbing. They suggest Esperanza may not have simply haunted the past, but that she still lingers, in places, in silences, even in us. And the closer you look, the more her presence begins to feel less like history, and more like a door. And what happens when that door opens? Well, that is the last part of this story. The last documents in Esperanza's file are not from the 18th century. They are from us. In 1922, a Cuban historian named Rafael Montoya gained access to the sealed convent archives in Havana. What he found was not the tidy narrative of execution the church had promised, but a maze of contradictions, burned pages, redacted diaries, lists of vanished names. Montoya wrote only one article before vanishing himself. The article is almost impossible to find now, but in the few surviving copies he makes a startling claim. Esperanza did not die in the 18th century. She was carried forward in silence itself. Every empire that sought to erase her only widened her reach. 3 months later, Montoya was found dead in his home. Cause of death: carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace. In the decades that followed, Esperanza appeared less in official documents and more in fragments. Folk songs, whispered stories, even psychiatric case notes. A patient admitted to a Havana asylum in 1948 described recurring visions of a barefoot woman in soot, who sat silently at the foot of his bed. He claimed she was teaching him to burn without fire. Doctors dismissed it as delusion. But what unsettles me most is the file's marginal note, written by the attending physician. Other patients report the same figure. Appears to be collective hallucination. Avoid further discussion. Triggers contagion. Contagion. The word itself admits fear. Not of one woman, but of an idea spreading uncontrollably like smoke through walls. By the late 20th century, Esperanza had been absorbed into revolutionary folklore. Protesters in 1960s Cuba invoked her in chants, though never by name, only by symbol. A circle, cut with 2 lines, appeared painted on factory walls, carved into school desks, even scrawled in prisons. Officials erased it, of course. But the more they erased, the more it multiplied. And here is the unsettling truth. Silence is not absence. It is pressure. Every time Esperanza's story was suppressed, it pressed harder into the cracks of memory. Every erasure became a scar. And scars, in their own way, are a kind of record. The most chilling account I have ever read is from 1987. A researcher working on oral histories in rural Matanzas interviewed an elderly woman. The woman claimed that as a girl she once wandered into the ruins of San Aurelio, the silent village. She found an old furnace still intact. And beside it, a woman sitting barefoot, hands folded, staring into the embers. The girl asked her name. The woman did not answer. She only lifted her hand, pressed a finger to her lips, and whispered, not a word but a sound like wind drawing through stone. Then she was gone. The elderly woman told the researcher, I have not spoken her name in 70 years. But when I close my eyes I still smell it. Not ash. Not coal. Something else. Something that waits. So where does this leave us? Was Esperanza a woman who survived unspeakable violence and took vengeance in fire? Was she a myth forged in the cracks of empire? Or is she something more, an embodiment of silence itself, born from centuries of forced forgetting? The truth may never be fixed, and perhaps that is fitting, because the furnace does not preserve, it consumes, reshapes, transforms. And maybe Esperanza's greatest act was not burning 17 men alive. Maybe it was becoming unforgettable by being erased. As I read her file, I cannot help but feel watched. The silence between these words feels heavy, almost listening. And I wonder, how many stories like hers have been buried, burned, forgotten? How many names have been struck from the record, yet still breathe in the margins? If Esperanza teaches us anything, it is this. Silence is never empty. It waits. It accumulates. And when the weight is too much, it burns. If you have walked this far into the archive, leave a comment with the phrase, "The furnace is open." It will mark you as one who has seen what others were never meant to see. And if you wish to keep descending with us, subscribe, not for entertainment, but as initiation into our society of truth seekers. Together we will keep opening the doors history tried to seal. But before we close, listen carefully. The story of Esperanza is not finished. Even now in Havana, the ruins of that furnace still stand rusted shut. Some say if you press your ear against its door, you can hear faint humming, low, steady, like a woman's voice waiting in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, silence is still listening back. History hides more than it reveals.